All right, Dan, the second batch of college football playoff rankings is now out. Not a whole lot of change, at least not a whole lot of unexpected change, with the exception of one thing, which I'm sure we will discuss here momentarily.
Sure.
Here is what your top 10 looks like. At the top, we've got Georgia. We've got Alabama unchanged at 1-2. We've got Oregon sliding up a spot. We've got Ohio State sliding up a spot. That, of course, being because of the Michigan State loss a week ago. Cincinnati also slid up a spot. They're now firmly entrenched, firmly in air quotes, at number 5, followed closely by Michigan, Michigan State, Oklahoma at 8, Notre Dame up at number 9, and Oklahoma State at number 10. Looking at that top 10, what are your thoughts?
Well, the headline is what the headline is for everybody. It's that head-to-head matters with regard to Oregon, Ohio State, with what the Ducks did in Columbus in week 2, but not as much seemingly with Michigan ranked ahead of Michigan State, a team they very recently lost to. It wasn't a beginning of the season loss.
It was 2 weeks ago.
It was 2 weeks ago, and both of those losses, Ohio State's loss and Michigan's loss, were pretty close. Ohio State had a chance at the end, and Michigan was right there and had a lead late in that game. So it's how does the committee justify those two things when there are many data points to deal with, but how do we place more importance on Oregon's win? I suppose it was on the road. I suppose they never trailed in that game, whereas Michigan was up and looked relatively strong in that game, but lost. And so it's the question lingers, what matters? What actually matters?
And look, we always are at this point when it comes to the college football playoff rankings, especially the early versions of the rankings. I think the hope is that eventually it's all going to kind of work itself out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't have a great level of confidence that it will in 2021 just because we've had so much chaos. But I look, the committee did two things with batch number 1. It laid down 2 precedents. The first was that head-to-head matters to some extent. Not in all cases, but in most cases, it seems like they put some weight on that. Sure. The other thing that they did was they laid this predicate for the eye test. And we saw that with Oklahoma and more controversially with what they did with Cincinnati, ranking them number 6 in the first batch of rankings. Now, most of the teams at the top slid up, but now with Michigan State falling behind Michigan, the fact that they played 2 weeks ago, the fact that they, granted they had to come back to win, but they did win. They looked good down the stretch in getting that W. For the committee to say that they felt Michigan was the more quote unquote complete team.
Right.
I just do games even matter at this point? Why even bother playing?
It's a fascinating question because if you look at Michigan's season thus far, so if Michigan's the more complete team, what's the case for Michigan being a more complete team? Quarterback play has been underwhelming, and their signature win was over Wisconsin, a game in which Graham Mertz gets hurt basically right at the half. It's a 13-10 game. Graham Mertz gets hurt, and then Michigan distances themselves from what we believe to be an excellent half team in Wisconsin, right? The offense seems to have gotten better and has been clicking more, and the defense has been outstanding all season long for the most part. So that's Michigan's most complete win, unless I'm forgetting something. They have Penn State this week, and Michigan State has had some clunker performances. Now, the win against Miami, the context is different because it was a different starting quarterback for Miami at that time. It was De'Aaron King. And so I'm not sure what the case against Michigan State is, other than the fact that losing to Purdue is less impressive than losing to Michigan State, which Michigan State can't do. So that's sort of the conversation about, okay, Ohio State losing to Oregon is more impressive than Oregon losing to Stanford. But it's just the fact that it just happened 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And all Michigan has done since is beat up on an Indiana team that we don't perceive to be all that good at this point, 10, 11 weeks into the season. It really is. I mean, the conversation around the playoff, and we can have this conversation, is everybody subjectively wants to figure out an objective measurement tool, which doesn't exist, right?
Right. Yeah. And, the topic of the Michigan State loss to Purdue is interesting. We only talked about the top 10 at the start of this video, but Purdue jumped from being unranked all the way up to number 19 in this batch of rankings. They were one of the big winners alongside I guess A&M moved up, NC State moved up,
Right.
Wisconsin, Pitt. There were a couple other teams that Arkansas moved into the top 25.
Yeah.
But Purdue is a really interesting case because of the quality of 2 top 5 wins. Who knows what happens this weekend against Ohio State? Perhaps they could add a third to that as well. Purdue is not looking as bad of a loss as maybe the committee would want to have you believe. Maybe that's why they only dropped Michigan State to number 7 in this batch of rankings.
Right.
The other thing that I would point out, and I'm very curious in as a Notre Dame fan, because of the way that they now in week 2 seem to be putting more of a value on the eye test, at least as it relates to Michigan State, does that now lay the groundwork for potentially ranking Notre Dame in front of Cincinnati when push comes to shove after week 14, when the rubber really meets the road? It's definitely an easier case for them to say, well, look, they played weeks ago. It's a different Notre Dame team now. We think Notre Dame's the more complete team.
But is it a different Notre Dame team?
I think it is. I think they're better. I think they've matured. I'm not saying I agree with that sentiment, but I'm saying that's an even easier case to make than the one that they just tried to make with Michigan and Michigan State, because it was only 2 weeks ago, Dan.
Yeah. Well, here's the big thing about Notre Dame and perhaps jumping Cincinnati. They're a more mature team. They've come together more because they've played the USC defense, the North Carolina defense, and the Navy defense. And they're about to play the Virginia defense.
I'm not saying I agree with it.
Totally.
And I also don't agree with ranking Michigan ahead of Michigan State. But I'm saying if they are now going to set a new precedent, being that we're just going to rank these teams by eye test and whatever makes us feel good, you could totally see them doing this. It's, when push comes to shove, given the edge to Notre Dame.
Yeah, I would have Cincinnati probably at this point, even though, isn't it kind of funny that Tulsa is the secret nucleus of the college football season, having played Ohio State, Cincinnati, and Oklahoma State, who's just sort of there looming and may have to beat Oklahoma twice to get into the playoff conversation in earnest. Tulsa may be good. They just have also had an impossible schedule, much like Nebraska is another secret nucleus, having played the Michigan schools and Ohio State and Oklahoma. And so what do you do against Nebraska? Or what have you done against Nebraska actually is a comparable metric, which is very strange to say, with Oklahoma having played that game. So, no, there are fascinating sort of subplots here. But I do think if you look at every team's schedule, essentially, aside from Georgia, who's the only team at this point, even though they had the win against Clemson in which they don't score an offensive touchdown, that's their lone performance blemish, I would say. Yes?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So it's fascinating in that there are cases for and against everybody. There's no ironclad way to look at this list of teams and say this is how you should measure them. And it's, as you already alluded to, it's all going to sort itself out this month. We're getting worked up over something that is far from complete. But it is good to sort of look at these rankings and say, this is where the committee is standing at this point after 10 weeks. And it doesn't make sense. There's no rhyme or reason to it that you can point to like, okay, this is them adhering to this standing, this viewpoint, or this whatever, this thing that they've talked about in years past. So, no, it's all going to sort itself out. I am going to be honest here and say I have a subjective way that I'd like to see the playoff look at teams. And it's completely subjective. It's completely my opinion. And I've said this from the start. All I want from a playoff, if we're going to get 4 teams, I want the best combination of quarterbacks and defenses. I want the 4 teams who can mount the best combination of quarterbacks and defenses that actually win games, that don't have the second order wins like Bill Connolly likes to talk about. You know, Ohio State outplayed Oregon. Okay, well, they didn't lead in that game at all. So maybe that doesn't really apply. I'm looking at those teams, and I guess my 4th team, if I have the 4 teams with that combination, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, I don't know how you can make a case for anybody other than Cincinnati not losing a game, having a top 20, 25-ish offense, and having a top 10-ish defense. I know their level of competition. I know that they were a weird circumstance away from losing to Tulsa, but I don't know that team that I'd rather see in the playoff.
Yeah,
if that's the combo I'm Dan Rubenstein is looking for.
You made mention of on our preview show for Week 11, which you can go and download and listen if you click on the description. how it's really the hall of really good this year in college football. There's no hall of fame. There's no hall of great. It's just the hall of really good, presumably outside of Georgia.
Right.
I think the case that you can make in the past against, let's say, a team like a Boise was that, well, or UCF maybe is a better analog. Well, we've seen what they can do against American teams, and we don't think they've got the defense to go toe-to-toe with some of the big guys, so we're just going to rank them lower than everybody else. Okay. I'm not sure I totally buy that, but I at least get where they're coming from.
Sure.
In a year like 2021, where there's been so much chaos, where we've seen Cincinnati go on the road and beat Notre Dame, you can tell me that Cincinnati would lose to Georgia. You can tell me that Cincinnati would lose to Bama or any of these teams.
Definitely.
What you can't do is make a really great case for them getting blown out, for them being uncompetitive against an Oregon, against a Michigan, against a Michigan State. I feel like Cincinnati could probably go toe-to-toe with any of these teams ranked here, and you'd feel pretty good about that matchup. They might lose, but they would at least be competitive. We saw them be competitive against Georgia fairly recently. Yeah. So I think that's kind of where they lose me with this ranking here, especially as it relates to Cincinnati. I don't know who's good outside Georgia. I don't know if anybody does. That's part of the charm of the 2021 season. I think you can make a really good case that Cincinnati is at least competitive. And by the time this is all said and done, all we want is competitive playoff games because, let's be honest, they haven't really been that competitive.
No.
Throughout the span of this 14 playoff, they haven't really been that competitive. I'd like to see competitive playoff games. I think Cincinnati's probably good enough to at least rise to that occasion.
This is the likeliest year because of, and no, look, Georgia plays defense better than anybody does anything, but it's still a somewhat error-prone Stetson Bennett at the moment starting for Georgia, and everybody else has, look, Alabama's lost and looked kind of garbagey on offense last week against LSU at home, an LSU team that's clearly reeling. And, you know, whether it's Ohio State and the defensive adjustments they needed to make against some truly heinous offenses that they've played since the Oregon matchup. But there is a case to be made that, like we've both now mentioned, that nobody's excellent all around. And
no, nobody is.
I can't fully see a recipe for beating the current iteration of Georgia right now. But if Georgia were to have a stud quarterback, it would be impossible for me to find. If they had that quarterback, if they had receiver health all season long, if their running backs were busting some bigger runs, it would be near impossible to find the iteration of another team. I love that word this morning. I don't know why, iteration. To find something else. If we can go off the rails for a moment, I was thinking about this in the shower because that's where I do my best thinking, Ty. I think the following is true in most years, but I love it when my personal belief system aligns, like life belief system, aligns with what's happening in the sport I cover, college football. And I preach hydration. I preach sleep. I preach eating fermented foods and foods with fiber. I preach all of these things. I think this year, perhaps more than any other recent year, though I'm willing to go back and be refuted on this, is a lesson in quality twos. You know what I'm talking about here, Ty?
I think so.
Okay. Talking about poops. That's the life quality two. But you look at this sport this season, at the top, in the middle, whatever, at the teams on the outside looking in at the playoff, Georgia is starting what or who at quarterback, and they haven't missed a beat. A quality two, correct?
Yeah.
Oregon, had they had a quality two at either quarterback or offensive coordinator, we're probably not talking about a loss to Stanford. And we're not needing to use a measuring stick to look at them in Ohio State. They're probably the number 2 team without question as an undefeated Power 5 school.
What you're getting at here, to be fair, is what has separated the wheat from the chaff in college football for years. It's a matter of depth.
It's a matter of depth. You know, obviously the best teams have the best ones, but a lot of teams have comparable ones. It's when somebody gets hurt. It's when somebody's academically ineligible. It's when somebody's suspended. It's when somebody, you know, is contact tracing in the modern world and unable to play. What does the backup look like? And at Ohio State, what happened after the Oregon game? Well, they made a change at who's calling the defensive plays. And so far, it looks like on their defensive staff, they have a quality number 2, right?
Right.
Now, if Notre Dame has that quality number 2 option at quarterback and Jack Cohn's not throwing interception or Tyler Buckner's not throwing an interception against Cincinnati, maybe we're talking about Notre Dame in this position as a current playoff team. If Michigan's number 2 at quarterback doesn't fumble that ball late against Michigan State, what are we talking about in terms of Michigan and where they stand? If Oklahoma doesn't have an option ready at quarterback behind Spencer Rattler, who's struggling.
They've got 2 losses.
They've got a couple losses, but guess what they have, Ty? A quality 2, a quality number 2. Oklahoma State got pushed by Missouri State. Shane Illingworth pulls out that game. I mean, he doesn't lose that game, but Missouri State has an opportunity to win that game twice, down a touchdown in week 1. But Shane Illingworth did enough, and they win that game. Texas A&M looks like their season's donezo with Haynes King going down with his leg injury. Yeah. Not only is their number 2 quality, I don't think he's amazing, but it's a quality enough number 2 to beat Alabama, they themselves, a quality number 2.
Yeah. And how about Wisconsin? If Wisconsin had a quality 2.
Absolutely.
Either at offensive coordinator or at quarterback, it might be a different story for them. Iowa could also be grouped into that same category.
Iowa's absolutely in there.
We will find out about Alex Padilla, perhaps moving forward, if that's a move that they should have made sooner. But I think you're right. And the depth
By the way,
conversation.
Purdue, who starts at quarterback this year? Jack Plummer. What do they have behind Jack Plummer, who ends up beating Iowa and Michigan State? A quality 2.
No, look, the depth conversation is one that rages deep into every college football season and certainly on the recruiting trail.
Yeah.
It is what separates the really good teams from the teams that aren't so good. This year, perhaps because of the COVID scenario last year, teams getting an opportunity to build depth earlier or in a different way because of not playing, because of the extra year of eligibility, who knows? We do see an unprecedented level of parity, and perhaps some of this depth is a reason why. It will be very interesting to see what transpires from here on out. Some teams that I'm watching very quickly, I'm watching to see what Oklahoma does. Oklahoma's got a really big game this weekend against Baylor. They also have Oklahoma State on the schedule. Oklahoma has a ton of upward mobility. Michigan State, despite the fact that the committee in puzzling fashion ranked them behind Michigan, still has a lot of room to grow. They've got Penn State, they've got Ohio State on the schedule. That top 5, I think, remains very volatile. The top 7, the top 10 remains very volatile this year moving forward. And I'm also very curious to see what happens with a team like a Notre Dame. Notre Dame's got a primetime game this weekend against Virginia.
Yep.
I expect that they're going to take care of business there. They're going to run the crap out of the ball, and they're going to do their part to put as many points on the board as they can in front of a national audience. But Notre Dame's schedule from here on out is pretty smooth sailing. Doesn't mean they won't find a way to lose, but they've definitely looked better as of late. And I think by virtue of what we saw the committee do here in week 2 of their playoff rankings anyway, there's room to grow for there's room to grow for Notre Dame. I almost said Penn State.
Who makes up your top 4, and what are your qualifications? If I'm saying quarterback and defense, I have Ohio State ahead of Oregon.
Yeah.
If
I think for me, it's Georgia, it's Alabama, it's probably Cincinnati, and it's probably Oregon.
Okay.
I would probably put them in that order for now. I do think Ohio State is better than both Oregon and Cincinnati. I get that, or maybe I'm pulling a committee here, but I do think it's a different team now. It's a different Ohio State team.
Think, yeah. Well, here's the thing, though, about Ohio State is we still don't know a lot. You have the Nebraska nucleus, but the offenses that Ohio State have faced, as I mentioned earlier, have been truly bad. So we really don't know. Ohio State, I think, has the opportunity.
They have the opportunity, and they will have some games here down the stretch that I think will, hopefully, if I'm right, bear that out. The ceiling for Ohio State with the talent that they have on offense is definitely higher than Oregon's. I don't think there's any question about that. Oregon won head-to-head in Columbus. That might be singularly the best win of any of these teams here on the list. We'll see how it bears itself out over the next couple weeks. I'm not totally sold on the fact that Oregon's going to win out.
No, same. They have a tricky matchup against Washington State this week, and Utah is in Salt Lake City at altitude, like I always like to point out, and Oregon State's a rivalry game. We're talking about 3 rush defenses that aren't particularly good, but that may not matter. You're right about Ohio State, though. And the thing that troubles me about Ohio State and feeling all that confident is I don't know what their defense has done against a strong offense, because their signature win came against Penn State at home with the 90th ranked points per drive offense. Penn State does not field a good offense and has not in 2021. Some of that is injury, but it's just the reality of Penn State had a quality what, Ty?
Yeah.
Number 2 behind Sean Clifford. We might be looking at them in a different light. But alas, they don't.
No. Well, look, the conversation, the debate around the playoff rankings will continue over the next few weeks. We urge you, if you've got a thought, please do weigh in the comment section. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Click the like button and click the bell button so that you are up to speed on all the new content that we drop. We'll also post the link down in the description for how you can subscribe to this show on Apple Podcasts and how you can find it on Spotify as well. Yep. We encourage you to jump on in, be part of the Verballerhood, and let us know your thoughts here on the committee's Week 2 college football playoff rankings.
Hey, thanks for watching. Consider, if you haven't, subscribing to the channel and hitting that little bell to be alerted, and listening to the podcast at solidverbal.com.